The photograph that would shatter David Lawson's carefully rebuilt life was taken by accident during his first vacation in over a decade, captured through the window of a Parisian cafe while he was attempting to document the architectural details of the Notre Dame Cathedral for a professional project he was considering in Seattle. The image, meant to showcase the cathedral's flying buttresses against the afternoon sky, instead captured something impossible. His wife Priya walking hand in hand with his best friend Michael Turner along the Seine, both of them laughing with the carefree intimacy of long-term lovers who had no awareness they were being observed by the husband who had spent 10 years mourning her death. The shock of recognition was so complete that David initially questioned his own sanity, staring at the digital display of his camera while sitting in the crowded cafe, surrounded by tourists and locals who continued their conversations in rapid French while his world collapsed around him. Priya's distinctive profile, the way she tilted her head when listening intently, her characteristic hand gestures that had been burned into his memory through 23 years of marriage, all were unmistakable, despite the sophisticated European clothing and the confident bearing that seemed different from the woman he remembered losing in what he had believed was a tragic automobile accident outside Mumbai 10 years earlier. The presence of Michael Turner in the photograph was almost more devastating than seeing Priya alive, as Michael had been David's primary source of emotional support during the darkest period of his grief, the friend who had helped him navigate funeral arrangements, insurance claims, and the overwhelming practical challenges of single parenthood, while processing the loss of someone who had been both wife and business partner in their shared architectural ventures. Michael's intimate body language with Priya, the protective way he guided her through the crowded sidewalk, suggested a relationship that had been developing for much longer than the few minutes captured in David's accidental photograph. The automobile accident that had supposedly claimed Priya's life had occurred during what was meant to be a brief visit to her family in Mumbai, a trip that had been planned to resolve some business matters related to her deceased parents' estate and to reconnect with relatives she hadn't seen since immigrating to the United States 25 years earlier. The official reports that David had received through the American consulate described a collision with a commercial truck on a busy highway outside the city, with Priya's remains being too severely damaged for repatriation, necessitating immediate cremation, according to Hindu customs and local legal requirements. The grief that had consumed David for the past decade had been compounded by guilt over their final conversation, which had ended in an argument about finances and her increasing secretiveness about phone calls and unexplained absences that he had attributed to stress about her family's legal complications rather than recognizing as potential signs of extramarital involvement. His last words to Priya had been spoken in anger about her decision to travel alone rather than allowing him to accompany her, making her death seem like punishment for his failure to be a more understanding and supportive husband during what he now realized might have been a period of crisis in their marriage. The 10 years following Priya's supposed death had been marked by David's withdrawal from social activities and professional networking that had previously been central to his architectural practice, as he found it impossible to maintain enthusiasm for creative projects or business relationships that reminded him of the plans and dreams he had shared with Priya before her supposed death. His architectural work became increasingly solitary and technical, focusing on residential projects that required minimal client interaction while providing sufficient income to support himself and his daughter Anna through her high school and college years. Anna's reaction to her mother's death had been complicated by her age at the time, 15 years old, and already struggling with typical adolescent identity issues that were exacerbated by the sudden loss of her primary female role model and confidant. The grief counseling that David had arranged for both of them had helped somewhat, but Anna's relationship with her father had become strained by his emotional unavailability and her sense that she was required to be strong for his sake rather than being allowed to process her own complicated feelings about her mother's death and its impact on their family dynamics. Michael Turner's support during this period had seemed like a lifeline for David, providing practical assistance with household management and parenting decisions, while also offering emotional companionship that helped him avoid complete isolation from human connection. Michael's divorce status and his apparent understanding of loss and loneliness had made him an ideal confidant during David's worst moments, creating a friendship that had deepened significantly during the years following Priya's supposed death. The Paris trip that led to David's devastating discovery had been suggested by Michael himself, who had argued that David needed to break out of his self-imposed isolation and reconnect with the architectural inspiration that had originally driven his career passion. The timing of the trip, coordinated through Michael's travel connections and business contacts, had seemed like evidence of genuine concern for David's welfare, rather than a calculated risk that brought him to a location where he might accidentally encounter the truth about his wife's continued existence. The initial paralysis that David experienced while staring at the photograph was followed by a desperate need to verify what he was seeing, leading him to abandon his architectural documentation project and begin following Priya and Michael through the streets of Paris, with the kind of desperate determination that he hadn't felt since the early days of his grief, when he had obsessively called hospitals and morgues in Mumbai trying to confirm the details of her supposed death. The surveillance that David conducted over the next 3 days in Paris was both methodical and emotionally devastating, as he systematically documented Priya and Michael's activities, while struggling to process the implications of their obvious intimacy and the comfortable familiarity with which they navigated the city together. Their routine suggested long-term residence rather than tourist activities, with visits to local markets, regular cafe appointments, and interactions with neighbors and shopkeepers who clearly recognized them as established members of the community rather than temporary visitors. The apartment building where David eventually traced them was located in the fashionable 7th arrondissement, featuring the kind of elegant architecture and expensive location that would require substantial financial resources to maintain, suggesting that Priya and Michael had been living well above the means that either of them had possessed individually during their previous lives in Seattle. The building's security system and doorman indicated that their residence was both comfortable and discreet, providing privacy that would be essential for maintaining false identities and avoiding detection by people from their past. The private investigator that David hired through his hotel's concierge service was a former police detective named Claire Duval, whose expertise in domestic investigations and corporate fraud made her uniquely qualified to uncover the truth about Priya's supposed death and the circumstances that had enabled her to establish a new life in Paris with David's best friend. Detective Duval's bilingual capabilities and her connections within both American and French law enforcement would prove essential for investigating crimes that crossed international boundaries and involved sophisticated document fraud. The preliminary investigation that Detective Duval conducted revealed that Priya had been living in Paris under the identity of Preeta Sharma, with documentation that appeared legitimate but that had been created through professional forgery services that specialized in providing new identities for individuals seeking to escape their previous lives for various reasons. The quality of the false documentation and the resources required to maintain their lifestyle suggested that Priya and Michael's conspiracy involved substantial financial planning and potentially criminal activity that extended beyond simple insurance fraud. The financial investigation that accompanied the identity verification revealed that Michael Turner had been systematically embezzling funds from his investment clients' accounts for several years before Priya's supposed death, using sophisticated techniques that had allowed him to accumulate substantial assets without triggering regulatory scrutiny or client complaints. The timing of these financial crimes suggested that his romantic involvement with Priya had provided motivation for theft that would fund their escape from their previous responsibilities and relationships. The emotional toll of conducting this investigation while maintaining his normal demeanor around Michael proved almost unbearable for David, who was forced to continue accepting his friend's support and companionship while knowing that Michael had been systematically deceiving him about the most fundamental aspects of his life for over a decade. The psychological strain of this deception created symptoms of anxiety and depression that required professional intervention to prevent complete emotional collapse. The communication with Anna about his discovery was one of the most difficult conversations David had ever attempted, as he struggled to find appropriate words to explain that her mother was alive, but had chosen to abandon their family in favor of a relationship with someone they had both trusted completely. Anna's initial response was denial and anger, directed not at her mother but at her father for suggesting something that challenged her entire understanding of her family history and personal identity. The legal consultation that David obtained regarding his options for pursuing criminal charges revealed the complexity of prosecuting fraud cases that involved international jurisdictions and sophisticated identity theft, particularly when the crimes had been committed years earlier, and the evidence would require cooperation from multiple law enforcement agencies with different legal systems and investigative procedures. The decision to confront Priya and Michael directly was motivated by David's need for understanding rather than simply revenge, as he hoped that face-to-face conversation might provide explanations that would help him process the betrayal and potentially find some path toward emotional resolution that would allow him to rebuild his life once again. The surveillance equipment that Detective Duval provided enabled David to document additional evidence of Priya and Michael's relationship, while also recording conversations that might be useful for legal proceedings, though the emotional difficulty of watching his wife and best friend together created additional trauma that complicated his ability to think clearly about appropriate courses of action. If you're enjoying these true crime stories, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep making more videos for you. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The confrontation between David and Priya took place in a small cafe near the Louvre, orchestrated by Detective Duval, to occur in a public setting that would provide safety while also allowing for discreet recording of their conversation for potential legal use. Priya's initial shock at seeing David was quickly replaced by a calculated composure that suggested she had prepared for this possibility, though her obvious discomfort and defensive body language revealed the psychological stress of maintaining elaborate deceptions for over a decade. The explanation that Priya provided for her fake death was a complex mixture of truth and continued manipulation, involving claims about mounting debts from her boutique business, threats from creditors who had connections to organized crime, and her fear that remaining in Seattle would endanger both David and Anna through association with her financial problems. Her presentation of these circumstances was designed to generate sympathy, while also justifying her decision to disappear rather than seeking help from her husband or legal authorities who might have provided protection. The revelation that her relationship with Michael had begun 2 years before her supposed death created additional layers of betrayal that David struggled to process, as it meant that his best friend had been systematically deceiving him about the most intimate aspects of his marriage, while providing false emotional support during what he believed was a period of marital stability and happiness. The timeline of their affair explained numerous inconsistencies in both Priya's and Michael's behavior that David had previously attributed to normal life stress, rather than recognizing as evidence of systematic deception. The financial crimes that had funded their escape and new life in Paris involved not only Michael's embezzlement from his investment clients, but also Priya's theft of assets from their joint marital accounts and her fraudulent life insurance claims that had provided substantial resources for establishing their false identities and comfortable lifestyle in France. The sophisticated nature of these crimes indicated professional assistance and careful planning that had been in progress for years before Priya's supposed death. The psychological manipulation that Priya employed during their conversation was designed to minimize David's anger, while also discouraging him from pursuing legal action that might disrupt the life she had built with Michael. Using techniques that included emotional appeals about their shared history, claims about her continued love for him despite her actions, and subtle threats about the consequences of exposing their crimes to authorities who might not understand the complex circumstances that had motivated her decisions. The impact on Anna of learning the details about her mother's fake death and ongoing affair was devastating but also clarifying, as it provided explanations for her mother's increasingly distant behavior during her final years in Seattle and validated Anna's intuitive sense that her family relationships had been somehow artificial or strained before her mother's supposed death. The counseling that Anna received helped her process these revelations while also providing strategies for maintaining her own psychological health, despite the destruction of her fundamental beliefs about her family. The coordination between Detective Duval and American law enforcement agencies required extensive paperwork and diplomatic cooperation to ensure that evidence gathered in France could be used in American criminal proceedings, while also protecting David's safety and legal interests during the complex process of building cases against both Priya and Michael for their respective roles in the conspiracy. The media attention that the case eventually attracted brought international focus to the sophisticated techniques that criminals could employ to fake deaths, while also highlighting the vulnerability of grieving families to continue. exploitation by individuals who had already demonstrated their willingness to cause devastating emotional harm for personal gain. The psychological evaluation that David underwent as part of the legal proceedings confirmed his mental stability and credibility, while also documenting the extensive trauma he had experienced through 10 years of unnecessary grief and the recent discovery that his mourning had been based on elaborate lies designed to facilitate his wife's escape with his best friend. The insurance investigation that was reopened following the discovery of Priya's survival revealed systematic fraud that had involved not only false death claims, but also sophisticated money laundering techniques that had enabled the proceeds to be transferred internationally and converted into assets that would be difficult for American authorities to trace and recover. The international cooperation that was required for investigating and prosecuting the case demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of cross-border law enforcement, particularly when dealing with sophisticated criminals who had resources and expertise that enabled them to exploit jurisdictional boundaries and legal differences to avoid accountability for their actions. The arrest of Michael Turner in Seattle was coordinated with French authorities to occur simultaneously with Priya's detention in Paris, preventing either conspirator from alerting the other or attempting to flee to jurisdictions where extradition might be more difficult to achieve. The evidence that had been gathered through Detective Duval's investigation and David's cooperation provided comprehensive documentation of financial crimes, identity fraud, and conspiracy that spanned multiple countries and had been ongoing for over a decade. The search of Michael's residence and business offices revealed extensive evidence of his embezzlement schemes, including detailed records of client account manipulations and sophisticated techniques for hiding stolen funds through shell corporations and offshore accounts that had been established specifically to launder criminal proceeds. The scale of his theft was far greater than initially suspected, affecting dozens of clients who had trusted him with their retirement savings and investment portfolios. Priya's resistance to extradition proceedings created additional legal complications that required diplomatic intervention and extensive documentation to demonstrate that she was indeed an American citizen who had faked her death to avoid legal and financial responsibilities, rather than a French resident who was being unfairly targeted by foreign law enforcement agencies. Her legal team's arguments about political persecution and cultural misunderstanding were systematically refuted through evidence of her criminal activities and false identity documents. The psychological profile that was developed for both defendants revealed personality traits and behavioral patterns that enabled them to maintain elaborate deceptions while causing severe emotional harm to people they claimed to care about, including narcissistic tendencies, lack of empathy, and sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation techniques that they had employed to maintain their victims' trust and compliance. The victim impact assessment that was conducted for David and Anna revealed the extensive psychological damage that had been caused by the conspiracy, including not only the original trauma of grieving Priya's supposed death, but also the additional trauma of discovering that their mourning had been unnecessary, and that trusted individuals had deliberately caused their suffering for personal gain. The financial investigation revealed that the proceeds from Priya's life insurance fraud and Michael's embezzlement had been used to purchase luxury assets in multiple countries, including real estate, art collections, and investment accounts that had been carefully structured to avoid detection by tax authorities and law enforcement agencies in both the United States and France. The international media coverage of the arrests and charges brought worldwide attention to the sophisticated techniques that modern criminals could employ to fake deaths, while also exploiting trusted relationships for financial gain, highlighting vulnerabilities in insurance verification procedures and the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies investigating crimes that crossed international boundaries. The cooperation that Priya eventually provided with investigators was motivated by plea bargain negotiations that offered reduced sentences in exchange for comprehensive testimony about the conspiracy and assistance in recovering assets that had been obtained through fraudulent means, though her credibility as a witness was compromised by her central role in the crimes and her obvious motivation to minimize her own culpability. The impact on Michael's investment clients created additional legal complications as they sought compensation for their losses, while also dealing with the emotional trauma of discovering that someone they had trusted with their financial security had been systematically stealing from them for years to fund his romantic escape with his best friend's wife. The corporate investigation that accompanied the criminal proceedings revealed systematic failures in oversight and compliance procedures at Michael's investment firm, leading to regulatory sanctions and enhanced supervision requirements that would help prevent similar fraud in the future, while also providing some compensation for affected clients. The diplomatic complications that arose from prosecuting crimes that had been committed across multiple jurisdictions required ongoing coordination between American and French law enforcement agencies, creating precedents for future cooperation, while also highlighting the resources and expertise required for effective international criminal investigations. The trial proceedings began 2 years after the initial arrests, with federal prosecutors presenting comprehensive evidence of a conspiracy that had defrauded insurance companies and investment clients of over $5 million, while causing immeasurable emotional damage to David and Anna through 10 years of unnecessary grief and psychological manipulation. The complexity of the case required extensive expert testimony about financial crimes, international fraud techniques, and the psychological impact of elaborate deception on victims and their families. The prosecution's case was built around the systematic nature of the conspiracy that Priya and Michael had maintained for over a decade, with evidence including forged death certificates, false witness testimony, sophisticated money laundering operations, and the elaborate false identities that had enabled them to live comfortably in Paris while their victims continued to suffer from their criminal activities. Priya's testimony as a cooperating witness provided crucial details about the planning and execution of her fake death, though her credibility was challenged by defense attorneys who argued that her cooperation was motivated solely by plea agreement benefits rather than genuine remorse or commitment to helping her victims recover from the trauma she had caused. Michael's defense strategy focused on portraying him as a victim of Priya's manipulation and emotional coercion, arguing that his genuine feelings for her had been exploited to secure his cooperation in schemes that he hadn't fully understood or intended to support. This approach required acknowledging some criminal activity while attempting to minimize his culpability and responsibility for the extensive harm caused to his clients and his best friend. The expert testimony about psychological manipulation revealed the sophisticated techniques that the defendants had employed to maintain their victims' trust, while systematically exploiting their emotional vulnerabilities for financial gain, including gaslighting, emotional blackmail, and the creation of false narratives that made their victims feel responsible for relationship problems that were actually caused by the defendants' criminal activities. David's testimony about the impact of the conspiracy on his family was emotionally devastating but legally essential for establishing the human cost of the defendants' crimes, including not only the financial losses but also the psychological trauma that had affected every aspect of his and Anna's lives for over a decade, while preventing them from forming healthy relationships or moving forward with their personal and professional goals. Anna's testimony provided a unique perspective on the long-term impact of elaborate deception on children and adolescents, describing how her mother's supposed death had shaped her identity and relationships throughout her formative years, while also affecting her ability to trust adults and form secure attachments with potential romantic partners. The financial expert testimony revealed the sophisticated techniques that had been employed to hide criminal proceeds and create false documentation that would support the defendants' new identities, including offshore banking, shell corporations, and international money transfers that demonstrated professional-level expertise in financial crimes and money laundering. The international cooperation that had been essential for investigating the case was highlighted through testimony from law enforcement officials in multiple countries who had worked together to trace the defendants' activities and gather evidence that would support prosecution despite the challenges posed by different legal systems and jurisdictional boundaries. The insurance industry expert testimony revealed systematic vulnerabilities in fraud detection procedures that had enabled the conspiracy to succeed, while also explaining the reforms that had been implemented in response to the case to prevent similar sophisticated deceptions in the future, though witnesses acknowledged that determined criminals with sufficient resources could still exploit remaining weaknesses. The sentencing phase of the trial focused on determining appropriate punishment that would reflect both the financial scope of the crimes and the psychological damage that had been inflicted on innocent victims, with victim impact statements providing detailed accounts of how the conspiracy had affected every aspect of the victims' lives, while expert testimony established the long-term consequences of systematic deception and betrayal. The sentencing of Priya and Michael reflected the serious nature of their crimes and the extensive planning that had been required to maintain their deception for over a decade, while causing ongoing harm to multiple victims who had trusted them completely. Priya received 18 years in federal prison for her role in insurance fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, while Michael received 25 years for embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy, with both sentences including substantial restitution requirements that would help compensate their victims. The victim impact statements that David and Anna provided during sentencing offered the court comprehensive accounts of how the conspiracy had affected their lives, including years of unnecessary grief, the destruction of their ability to trust others, and the ongoing trauma associated with discovering that fundamental beliefs about their family relationships had been based on lies and manipulation. The financial recovery process began with efforts to trace and freeze assets that had been obtained through criminal means, though the international nature of the conspiracy and the sophisticated money laundering techniques that had been employed made complete recovery difficult despite the best efforts of law enforcement and legal professionals working on behalf of the victims. The psychological treatment that David and Anna received during and after the trial addressed the complex trauma associated with learning that their grief had been unnecessary, while also helping them develop strategies for rebuilding their lives and relationships after discovering that their most trusted connections had been based on systematic deception and exploitation. The civil litigation that followed the criminal proceedings focused on recovering additional damages from the defendants and their accomplices, while also establishing legal precedents for holding criminals accountable for the comprehensive harm caused by elaborate deception schemes that exploited family relationships and professional trust for personal gain. The regulatory changes that were implemented in response to the case included enhanced verification procedures for death claims involving foreign jurisdictions, improved coordination between insurance companies and law enforcement agencies, and strengthened oversight of investment professionals who had access to client funds and personal information that could be exploited for criminal purposes. The international cooperation agreements that were negotiated as a result of the investigation created frameworks for more effective prosecution of transnational fraud, while also improving protection for citizens who might be victimized by criminals operating across multiple jurisdictions and exploiting differences in legal systems and law enforcement capabilities. The media coverage of the trial and sentencing brought sustained public attention to the sophisticated techniques that modern criminals could employ to exploit trust relationships, while also highlighting the long-term impact of elaborate deception on victims and their families, contributing to enhanced awareness and prevention efforts. The academic research that was prompted by the case contributed to enhanced understanding of psychological manipulation techniques and their impact on victims, while also advancing knowledge about effective treatment approaches for individuals recovering from systematic betrayal by trusted family members and friends. The victim advocacy work that David eventually undertook grew out of his recognition that his experience could help other individuals who had been victimized by similar elaborate deception schemes, providing them with practical guidance and emotional support, while also contributing to enhanced public awareness about fraud prevention and recognition. The insurance industry's response to the case included comprehensive reforms in fraud detection and prevention procedures that addressed the specific vulnerabilities that had been exploited in Priya's fake death scheme, while also improving coordination with law enforcement agencies to ensure that suspicious claims would receive appropriate investigation before benefits were paid. The long-term recovery process that followed the trial required David and Anna to rebuild their understanding of family relationships and personal identity, after discovering that fundamental beliefs about their shared history had been based on elaborate lies maintained by people they had trusted completely. The therapeutic work involved not only processing the trauma of systematic deception, but also developing new frameworks for evaluating trustworthiness and authenticity in future relationships. The relationship between David and Anna evolved during their shared recovery process as they worked together to process the complex emotions associated with Priya's crimes, while also rebuilding their family bond without the shared narrative of tragic loss that had previously defined their connection. Their counseling sessions revealed both the strength of their relationship and the ways that Priya's deception had affected their communication patterns and emotional expression. The investigation into other potential victims of Michael's investment fraud revealed that his criminal activities had affected numerous families and individuals who had trusted him with their financial security, leading to additional civil litigation and regulatory actions that demonstrated the widespread impact of sophisticated white-collar crime on vulnerable individuals and communities. The international law enforcement cooperation that had been essential for solving the case continued through ongoing efforts to identify and prosecute other criminals who employed similar techniques for international fraud, creating databases and communication protocols that would improve responses to future cases involving sophisticated deception schemes. The documentary film that was produced about the case brought widespread public attention to the vulnerability of grieving families to continued exploitation by trusted individuals, while also providing educational content about recognizing warning signs of elaborate fraud and the importance of maintaining appropriate skepticism, even in close personal relationships. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to the case included specialized counseling for individuals who had been victimized by trusted family members and friends, legal assistance for navigating complex recovery processes, and advocacy support for victims participating in lengthy criminal proceedings that could be re-traumatizing. The academic research that continued to grow out of the case contributed to enhanced understanding of the psychological techniques used in long-term deception, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies and therapeutic interventions for individuals recovering from systematic manipulation by people they had believed were trustworthy. The legislative initiatives that were supported by victim advocates and law enforcement officials included enhanced penalties for fraud crimes involving family relationships and positions of trust, improved resources for victims seeking justice and recovery, and strengthened international cooperation agreements that would facilitate investigation and prosecution of sophisticated transnational crimes. The insurance industry's continued evolution in response to fraud cases like David's included enhanced technology for verifying international documentation, improved risk assessment techniques that could identify potential fraud before claims were paid, and more sophisticated training for investigators who handled complex cases involving presumed death and missing persons. The corporate governance reforms that were implemented in response to Michael's embezzlement included enhanced oversight of investment professionals, improved client protection procedures, and stronger whistleblower protections that would encourage reporting of suspicious activities before they could cause extensive damage to victims and their families. The psychological research that David and Anna participated in provided valuable data about the long-term impact of elaborate deception on family relationships, while also contributing to the development of more effective therapeutic interventions for individuals recovering from systematic betrayal by trusted individuals who had exploited their emotional vulnerability for criminal purposes. The establishment of the David Lawson Foundation 5 years after Priya's conviction represented his transformation from victim to advocate, creating a permanent institution dedicated to supporting families affected by elaborate deception schemes, while also funding research and education initiatives that address the sophisticated techniques used by criminals to exploit trust relationships for financial and personal gain. The International Conference on Family Fraud that the Foundation sponsored annually brought together survivors, law enforcement officials, researchers, and policymakers from around the world to share knowledge and coordinate efforts to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises that exploited personal relationships and professional trust for criminal purposes, with proceedings that contributed to enhanced cooperation and improved prevention strategies. The training programs that David developed for law enforcement agencies included specialized techniques for investigating complex fraud cases involving international jurisdictions, while also providing officers with understanding of the psychological impact of elaborate deception on victims and the importance of trauma-informed investigation methods that protected victims' emotional welfare while gathering necessary evidence. The research initiatives that the Foundation funded contributed to enhanced understanding of the psychological techniques used by sophisticated criminals, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies and therapeutic interventions for individuals recovering from systematic manipulation and betrayal by trusted family members and professional associates. The legislative advocacy that David undertook included support for enhanced penalties for fraud crimes involving positions of trust and family relationships, improved resources for victims seeking justice and recovery, and strengthened international cooperation agreements that facilitated investigation and prosecution of crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The Victim Support Network that developed around the Foundation's work provided ongoing assistance for families affected by similar crimes, while also maintaining political pressure for continued improvements in prevention, investigation, and prosecution of sophisticated fraud schemes that exploited trust, relationships, and cultural differences to avoid detection and accountability. The corporate consulting services that the Foundation provided to businesses and financial institutions included assessment of vulnerabilities to employee fraud and development of enhanced oversight procedures that could prevent exploitation of client relationships and company resources for criminal purposes. The psychological treatment protocols that were developed through the Foundation's research provided specialized approaches for helping families recover from elaborate deception, while also addressing the unique challenges faced by children and adolescents whose development had been affected by systematic lies about fundamental family relationships. The insurance industry partnerships that the Foundation established contributed to ongoing improvements in fraud detection and prevention, while also providing enhanced support for legitimate beneficiaries who needed assistance navigating complex claims processes that had been affected by criminal activity or sophisticated deception schemes. The media initiatives that the Foundation supported included documentary films, educational materials, and public awareness campaigns that provided practical information about fraud prevention, while also reducing stigma associated with victimization by trusted family members and professional associates who exploited emotional vulnerability for criminal purposes. The International Victim Advocacy Network that grew out of the Foundation's work provided ongoing support for individuals and families affected by sophisticated fraud, while also coordinating efforts to improve law enforcement responses and victim protection services across multiple countries and legal systems. The 10-year anniversary of David's discovery of Priya's survival marked a significant milestone in his journey from victim to advocate, as he reflected on the personal transformation that had occurred through his pursuit of justice, while also recognizing the broader impact that his case had achieved in protecting other vulnerable individuals from similar exploitation, betrayal by trusted family members and professional associates. The psychological research that had grown out of David's case continued to advance understanding of the long-term impact of elaborate deception on family relationships, while also contributing to the development of more effective therapeutic interventions and prevention strategies that could help potential victims recognize warning signs before becoming targets of sophisticated criminal schemes. The international law enforcement cooperation that had been essential to solving David's case had evolved into permanent frameworks for combating transnational fraud, while also providing models for investigating other types of sophisticated white-collar crime that exploited cultural differences and jurisdictional boundaries to avoid prosecution and accountability. The victim support services that had been enhanced in response to David's case continued to provide specialized assistance for families affected by elaborate deception, while also maintaining advocacy pressure for continued improvements in prevention, investigation, and prosecution of sophisticated fraud schemes that exploited trust relationships for criminal gain. The insurance industry's comprehensive reforms in response to the case had successfully prevented numerous fraud attempts, while also improving legitimate claim processing for grieving families who needed support during difficult times, with enhanced verification procedures and international cooperation agreements continuing to evolve in response to new criminal techniques. The corporate governance improvements that had been prompted by Michael's embezzlement had been adopted by financial institutions worldwide and had contributed to enhanced protection for clients, while also improving detection and prevention of employee fraud that could cause devastating losses to individuals and families who trusted professional advisors with their financial security. The academic partnerships that the Foundation had established with universities and research institutions continued to generate valuable research about criminal deception techniques, while also training new generations of law enforcement professionals, victim advocates, and mental health practitioners who would continue advancing knowledge and practice in combating sophisticated fraud. The legislative changes that David's advocacy had helped achieve continued to influence prosecution strategies and victim support services, while also deterring potential criminals from attempting similar sophisticated exploitation schemes, with enhanced penalties and resources providing meaningful protection for vulnerable individuals and families. The documentary films and educational materials that had been produced about David's case continued to provide awareness and prevention benefits for potential victims, while also generating ongoing resources for victim support services and continued research into fraud prevention and prosecution techniques. The relationship between David and Anna had not only survived the traumatic revelations about Priya's crimes, but had become stronger through their shared commitment to helping other families avoid similar victimization, with both of them contributing to the Foundation's work, while also building independent lives based on authentic relationships and professional fulfillment. The ongoing monitoring of international criminal networks revealed that while Priya and Michael's specific conspiracy had been successfully prosecuted, similar criminal enterprises continued to evolve and adapt their techniques to exploit new technologies and social platforms, highlighting the continued relevance of the prevention and prosecution strategies developed in response to David's case. 15 years after David Lawson discovered that his supposedly dead wife was living in Paris with his best friend, the legacy of his case continues to protect families from sophisticated deception schemes while demonstrating that even the most devastating betrayals can be transformed into forces for positive change through courage, persistence, and commitment to preventing others from experiencing similar victimization. The David Lawson Foundation has become an internationally recognized leader in fraud prevention and victim support, having directly assisted over 1,000 families, while also funding research and advocacy efforts that have contributed to systematic improvements in law enforcement responses and victim protection protocols. The legislative changes that David's advocacy helped achieve have been adopted across multiple jurisdictions and have contributed to more effective prosecution of fraud crimes involving family relationships and positions of trust, while also providing enhanced resources for victims seeking justice and recovery from elaborate deception schemes. The legal precedents established through his case continue to influence prosecution strategies and victim support services, while also deterring potential criminals from attempting similar sophisticated exploitation. The international law enforcement cooperation that was essential to solving David's case has evolved into permanent frameworks for combating transnational fraud, while also providing models for investigating other types of sophisticated white-collar crime that exploits cultural differences and jurisdictional boundaries to avoid prosecution. The specialized training programs and investigation techniques developed in response to his case continue to improve law enforcement effectiveness worldwide. The insurance industry's comprehensive reforms in response to the case have successfully prevented numerous fraud attempts, while also improving legitimate claim processing for grieving families who need support during difficult times. The enhanced verification procedures and international cooperation agreements continue to evolve in response to new criminal techniques, while maintaining the balance between fraud prevention and efficient service for legitimate beneficiaries. The psychological research inspired by David's case has contributed to enhanced understanding of the long-term impact of elaborate deception on family relationships, while also advancing knowledge about effective treatment approaches for individuals recovering from systematic manipulation and betrayal by trusted family members and professional associates who exploited emotional vulnerability for criminal purposes. The relationship between David and Anna has become a model for how families can recover from devastating betrayal, while also channeling their experience into meaningful social contribution that protects other vulnerable individuals from similar exploitation. Their shared commitment to advocacy work has strengthened their bond, while also providing purpose and healing that transformed personal tragedy into collective benefit. Anna's career as a victim advocate and her specialization in helping young adults recover from family deception has provided her with professional fulfillment, while also honoring the difficult experiences that shaped her adolescent years. Her work with other victims has demonstrated that even the most traumatic childhood experiences can be transformed into expertise that helps others while also providing personal healing and growth. The corporate governance reforms prompted by Michael's embezzlement have been adopted by financial institutions worldwide and have contributed to enhanced protection for clients, while also improving detection and prevention of employee fraud that could cause devastating losses to individuals and families who trust professional advisors with their financial security. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to David's case continue to provide specialized assistance for families affected by elaborate deception, while also maintaining advocacy pressure for continued improvements in prevention, investigation, and prosecution of sophisticated fraud schemes that exploit trust, relationships, and family bonds for criminal purposes. The academic partnerships that the Foundation established with universities and research institutions continue to generate valuable research about criminal deception techniques, while also training new generations of professionals who will continue advancing knowledge and practice in combating sophisticated fraud and supporting victims of elaborate deception schemes. The story of David Lawson serves as a permanent reminder that trust and vulnerability, while essential to meaningful relationships, must be balanced with appropriate awareness of the sophisticated predators who exploit normal family bonds and professional relationships to facilitate devastating crimes. His journey from victim to advocate demonstrates that even the most elaborate betrayals can be overcome through courage, professional support, and commitment to protecting others from similar exploitation. His legacy lives on through the thousands of families who have been protected by the awareness and prevention programs his advocacy made possible, the hundreds of victims who have received support and resources through his foundation's work, and the systematic improvements in law enforcement and victim services that emerged from the comprehensive response to his case. While the 10 years of unnecessary grief cannot,